The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be dividing my time today with the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Transport. And I'm pleased to rise on Bill C-43, the Economic Action Plan 2014 number 2. And as I do for all my speeches in this place, Mr. Speaker, in my preparation for these remarks, I was struck by the importance of the date I'm speaking, because I'm speaking for the second time on the budget from earlier this year, Mr. Speaker. I spoke for the first time in this House on April 4th. And in that budget, I praised the work of the late Jim Flaherty in those remarks, because at that time, Mr. Speaker, he had moved from our long-serving Minister of Finance to the MP for Whitby-Oshawa. That was April 4th. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, 6 days later, we lost our friend Jim, and I think this House and all Canadians recognize that this we're debating today is his last budget and really his gift to Canada of securing our economic future. And why it's important, Mr. Speaker, when I was reviewing my remarks and realizing I'm speaking today is the day that the new MP for Whitby-Oshawa, and since she's not yet taken her seat, I believe I can say Pat Perkins is her name. She'll be taking her seat in about an hour, Mr. Speaker. She will be taking her seat as a proud Conservative caucus member and former mayor of Whitby, who'd worked very passionately with people like Jim Flaherty, with our Prime Minister and with this government. So sometimes these significant dates and the tremendous public service of people like Jim and Pat need to be recognized in this House. And when I was reading my remarks given in this place on April 4th, I highlighted several parts of the budget, particularly some measures for small to medium-sized enterprises, research and development innovation like at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, trade and some of our trade work, as well as our reinvestment in the Last Post Fund for veterans, Mr. Speaker, something the Legion had been asking for that extends the century-long work by the Last Post Fund to modern-day veterans, Mr. Speaker, veterans post-Korean War who may be indigent at the time they pass, Mr. Speaker. And today's also important for me to speak because I think all members in this House are well served by the teams we have in our riding. And I'm fortunate to have Cheryl Stacey and Danielle from my riding here today in Ottawa at training. And without people like that serving our constituents, we wouldn't do the service we need to Canadians. So in my remarks today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to focus on some different parts of the budget and related amendments that are important to Canada and our prosperity, and I want to focus on why some of these measures are here. Often my friends in the NDP like to really just talk about how many pages a Budget Implementation Act is, but not actually read the pages, Mr. Speaker. You know, when you're looking at one of the most sophisticated economies in the world, tax measures, measures to promote growth and job creation, listening to families, promoting safe communities, there is going to be consequential regulations and amendments that's part of that. And if you dive into them, you'll see that they actually echo the demands of Canadians. So families, Mr. Speaker, the child fitness tax credit has been remarkably popular, supporting healthy activity for our young people and helping families bridge that extra gap as the cost of these sports and physical activities has gone up. This bill will implement our doubling of that tax credit and making it refundable as of next year, Mr. Speaker. I was very proud the Prime Minister chose Whitby to make this announcement and that we were part of it in the Ability Centre. So a direct measure that's been benefiting families, we're extending it and making it better. Consumers, Mr. Speaker. Consumers, particularly seniors in my riding, have asked me countless times, why do I have to pay to pay? Why do I have to pay for my paper bill if I want to get my paper bill? So, Mr. Speaker, that provision is in here as a consumer measure focused at giving choice to consumers, those who pay online, those who pay the traditional way. It's also part of our multi-year project of making the wireless sector more competitive and more accountable. So there's also measures in this bill, Mr. Speaker, that will see administrative monetary penalties added to the wireless code and continue our work to bring cell phone costs down for Canadians, both families and businesses. You'll see the direct input from charities, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, building on the exceptional work done in the previous budget and the introduction of the first-time donors super credit, encouraging Canadians to support the charitable sector. We're building on that, now allowing charitable groups and nonprofits and church groups to fundraise and do their activities by computer, Mr. Speaker, allowing them to do more modern fundraising efforts, Mr. Speaker. We've been listening to these charities and acting. NGOs, Mr. Speaker, you'll see their input reflected in here. I remember meeting Katie Seguin from Publish What You Pay in my extractive sector outreach, Mr. Speaker. Well, you'll see our G8 commitment made by the Prime Minister in Scotland to make resource companies around the world publish their payments in those countries. That's in here, Mr. Speaker. That's listening. That's building on the work groups and some of those NGOs are doing. Business, Mr. Speaker, particularly small business, we'll see their demands expressed through a number of groups, including CFIB in here, with our small business jobs credit, Mr. Speaker, which will see a benefit to 90% of EI dues paying employers, dropping their EI payroll taxes by up to 15%, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, not only securing the jobs of today, building them for tomorrow. That's listening. That's in here, Mr. Speaker. Victims. We've heard from victims advocates across the country, and that's in this Budget Implementation Act as well, Mr. Speaker. The Victims' Bill of Rights, as well as something that many advocates, including my friend from Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca, or excuse me, leader of the Green Party, she's been advocating for the DNA missing persons database, Mr. Speaker. Victims groups have asked to try and give closure to some of these families through that investment in the DNA databank. That's in here, Mr. Speaker. That's listening to victims. That's listening to groups across the country. And it's also an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, for small groups of residents like those in my riding to make an impact, Mr. Speaker. When I was elected in 2012, I met with a group who were upset at some of the development around a small aerodrome in Greenbank, Mr. Speaker, with large quantities of fill being brought in, and the expectation that because it was an aerodrome, there was no regulation permitted by both the local and provincial levels of government. That's not the case, Mr. Speaker. We've clarified that. You know, operations like the fill operations will only attract federal jurisdiction if they have a direct impact on aeronautics. But clearly there's a need to clarify this area. So another provision, we've listened, Mr. Speaker, I've advocated, a number of us have advocated, there's amendments to the Aeronautics Act clarifying the ability for the minister to set regulations around developments of these aerodromes, small ones, scattered throughout the country, and to make regulations with respect to consultations surrounding the development of these aerodromes, Mr. Speaker. So the great thing about a budget that is bringing Canada to a balanced budget in the next year, Mr. Speaker, spending in priority areas, offering tax relief to groups like families, small businesses, is in many ways, it goes back to my first remarks, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that the legacy of our friend Jim Flaherty will live on through the secure economy that he has provided Canada. Budgets like this one not only make sure our economic fundamentals are sound, because it takes prudent management, Mr. Speaker. Budgets don't balance themselves. It takes setting priorities. It takes establishing a plan. It takes building an environment friendly to job creation, innovation, and growth. But this will mark a turning point, Mr. Speaker, where Canada not only stands tall with our success domestically, we now serve as a beacon to our G7 counterparts, Mr. Speaker. Canada will be the first G7 nation for many years to have a balanced budget. What's more impressive about that, Mr. Speaker, we've balanced that budget through creating jobs, through spending in priority areas like record health transfers to provinces like mine in Ontario, but controlling the overall pace of growth of government, Mr. Speaker, and recognizing that small businesses, families, seniors, can't be leaned on and leaned on and leaned on time and time again just for the sake of growing every department of government and the size and scope of government, Mr. Speaker. So it's with a mixture of sadness and joy that I recognize that Mr. Flaherty's legacy is going to be executed through this final budget, which will pass this House and secure a strong future for Canada.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. Honorable député de Chambly-Bordua.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My colleague spoke about this infamous fitness tax credit, and the fact is that Canadian youth are getting a failing grade when it comes to activity, physical activity, and this tax credit hasn't been working. The fact is that I asked an order paper question a couple of months ago to find out whether the government had actually done any studies into the effectiveness of this policy. The answer was no. They had not done any policies, so I don't understand how they stand up all the time and say how effective it is. Some folks who did do studies, however, are the parliamentary budget officer, who showed us that the families that are benefiting from this tax credit are the ones that make the most money, that really top tier, when in reality, and those are families where the youth are already participating in sports anyways. So if we really want to help our youth get more active, we need to put into place measures that will actually help all families be able to participate in this way. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that nothing that this government has put forward in the last few years has done anything to improve the rate of physical inactivity amongst youth. And this policy is just another example of that. So I wonder if maybe he'd like to take the opportunity to correct the record, since his government actually hasn't studied the effectiveness of this policy.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I enjoy this period called questions and comments after speeches in the House, and my friend has demonstrated the comment portion of that time, because there's really no question there. What I will tell him, and he may find interesting, is the government consulted with an expert before implementing this child fitness tax credit, Mr. Speaker. They met with a world-class pediatrician with an MBA in public policy expertise to design this program. Minister Flaherty worked directly with that person, and the development of this exceptional program that not only promotes fitness, but allows families a little break so that they don't hesitate about signing their kids up for dance, hockey, soccer. That exceptional person that advised the minister got so excited by the public policy work she did, she's now the Minister of Labour in this government, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Charlottetown.
Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague opposite for his speech. I was a little surprised that he started out his speech by a reference to government support for the Last Post Fund, because we served together on the Veterans Committee at the time when a contribution to the Last Post Fund was enhanced. Part of that is good news, that the amount to go to the families of deceased veterans doubled, but the sinister part of it, and the member would know this very well, is that the government budgeted $65 million for the Last Post Fund that they knew that they couldn't and wouldn't spend. So the question for this member is first of all, will he admit that the money that was allocated for the Last Post Fund was never spent? And will he advise us how much of it was lapsed and therefore applied to the deficit? Or is it sort of like the $200 million for mental health? Is it going to be paid out over the next 50 years?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I enjoyed serving with my friend from Charlottetown on that committee, and we talked quite a bit about the Last Post Fund, and I'm glad his colleague from Guelph is here in the House today, because this is the way budgeting works, Mr. Speaker, is you have to set aside revenue that you forecast will be used. It's not exactly about using everything up in the time frame, it's about that estimate or that allocation. And when it comes to the Last Post Fund, this is a fund that Canadians should understand exists only for indigent veterans that fall through the cracks, that have an estate of $12,000 or less, not including their house or car, Mr. Speaker. So it's a small subset of Canadians, a fair amount. It was an amount the Liberal government set, actually, Mr. Speaker. So forecasting how many veterans will fall into those narrow parameters is very difficult. What a government has to do on an accrual counting basis is, once a statutory benefit's been created, enough funds have to be set aside to meet the anticipated demand, Mr. Speaker. The same thing works with the estimates, Mr. Speaker. You look at the statutory entitlement and then the budgetary entitlement as well, Mr. Speaker, and estimate your spend for the year. I think they actually know this, Mr. Speaker, but prefer to play games rather than talking the facts.
Here, here.